So the first thing we're going to look at, we'll just hit that controversial subject right now. We're going at autism. Autism prevalence in the United States continues to rise. The last study I saw came out of somewhere in New England and said 1 in 59 were being diagnosed with autism spectrum disorders. Yes, there's probably a difference of diagnosis, but I look around, I've worked in schools, there's definitely an increase. Children are just not as even-keeled, I guess I could say, as they seemed to be a few decades ago when I was a child. Go ahead. So, I've been suspicious of folic acid because someone else noted back in 2008 that once they started pushing folic acid for pregnant women to help reduce neural tube defects, there also started being an increase in autism spectrum disorders. So, I took my folic acid when I was pregnant, but only sometimes. You know, the OBGYN would say, "Are you taking it?" And I'd say, "Yes," but I wouldn't tell her how many times a week. I took it. See, the interesting thing about it is maternal use of folic acid in multivitamin supplements is associated with lower autism. At least that's what it looks like initially. However, if they take like little pregnant mice, is that mice? Yeah. And they feed the mothers a bunch of folic acid, then changes happen in the brains, especially the male brains of the developing embryos that look like what autism looks like in their brains. So there's reason to be suspicious of folic acid. Now, we are being told in various online resources that folic acid is just a naturally occurring form of folate. That's not quite an accurate representation of the whole picture. Folic acid does occur naturally, but it does not occur in our bodies or in food at the levels that we are using it. Folate, which occurs in various forms, is a wonderful thing, and I'm wholeheartedly in favor of it. Folic acid, which is generally synthesized in a lab and put into our vitamins and food because it's stable, I believe is too stable. It is known to inhibit the enzyme dihydrofolate reductase, or DHFR, and it causes a pseudo polymorphism. It looks like you have a mutation in the gene MTHFR, which we'll get back to why that's so important. So chronic excess folic acid intake appears to me to be counterproductive for optimal health and development. Next slide. Cyanocobalamin. This is a form of B12 that is again produced synthetically and used in vitamins and food because it is stable, just like with folic acid. You don't want things that are going to break down in heat if you want them to sit on shelves for a while. However, cyanocobalamin is so stable that they have found when looking at fetal brains that it's accumulating in the fetal brains. And they don't know why, and they don't know what the effect might be. They do know that they can help children with autism by giving them methylcobalamin. There are 4 kinds of cobalamin, and cyanocobalamin is one that does occur naturally, but again, not at the levels that we're getting from multivitamins or from fortified foods. Next slide. So, where do these come together? We need cobalamin, or vitamin B12, and folate for proper functioning of an enzyme called methylation synthase. The folate, right before it's used by methylation synthase, is processed by an enzyme that's coded for by the gene MTHFR. And if you go back a couple decades before the US was using so much folic acid, they were finding an association between MTHFR polymorphisms and autism spectrum disorder. So, what happens if you mess with the ability to get that MTHFR functioning properly, which we might be doing with excess folic acid? 2 years ago, May 2016, Johns Hopkins released the results of a study in which they followed the offspring of a large group of women. They had tested the women during pregnancy and found that the women who had very, very high levels of blood folate, their children were twice as likely to be diagnosed with autism down the road. Then they also found that the women who had very, very high levels of vitamin B12 in their blood at the time they gave birth, their children were 3 times as likely to be diagnosed with autism down the road. Now keep in mind, you don't get to these very, very high levels typically without multivitamin or prenatal vitamin supplement use. The really shocking thing about this was that if they had both of those combined, high B12 and high folate in their blood when they gave birth, the women's children were more than 16 times as likely to end up being diagnosed with autism spectrum disorders later. No one knows why this has happened. I'm surprised it hasn't garnered more press. We clearly need to be cautious with multivitamins. So, this is the enzyme we've been talking about, methionine synthase. It needs B12 in a form it can use, not one that's so stable it can't use it, and folic acid, or folate, preferably not in excess of folic acid, since that messes with a gene that affects the function of methionine synthase. Now, methionine synthase is important for recycling homocysteine-to-methionine. As part of this cycle, after methionine, you get to SAMe. That's a fairly popular supplement. But what SAMe is involved in is methylation of DNA. Methylation is where you have little methyl groups that get put on genes and either cause certain things to be expressed or not expressed. And this is the field of epigenetics, if you want to read more about it. So if you are not getting the right amount of SAMe at the right time, that can alter, I believe, the methylation of the DNA so that certain genes are talking or not talking when they should or should not be. It's going to change things. So I looked at this and I thought, all right, methionine synthase is where B12 and folate come together. What if there's a backup? And I was surprised to find out there is what we call a secondary pathway from homocysteine to methionine. It's this VHMT enzyme, or betaine homocysteine S-methyltransferase. And it needs two things to function well that we can give to it with our diet. There is zinc, so I've got some zinc here to show off. And then the other is glycine betaine. It gets its name from beets. So when you boil up some beets, that betaine is boiling right out of the beets. It's in that liquid. Betaine is high in, It's high in many grains. It's high in vegetables like spinach, chard, and beets, of course. It's very high in amaranth and quinoa. It's moderately high in wheat and rye. I believe there's a little in corn, but very little. Wouldn't rely on that. But the interesting thing about glycine betaine is it's an osmolyte. It helps protect cells from salt-induced flow through the cell membrane. So as I learned more about glycine betaine, I thought, well, what if our reliance on digestive fluid to get the glycine betaine out of food is misplaced? What if there's just not enough absorption happening out of the glycine betaine from our stomach fluid? Because that's basically hydrochloric acid, which is fairly similar in its effects to dissociated NaCl or salt water. Which, wait a minute, betaine protects from salt water. So what if betaine's protecting some of the food we eat from giving up its glycine betaine and other nutrients? So I was like, okay, I have lived in Poland, and if there's one thing Poles love, it's their barszcz czerwony, red barszcz. Yes?
Oh.
Go ahead. Okay. I want to thank my daughter for running the video and the slides. Thank you, Lisa. Okay. So in Poland, they eat soup regularly. They're one of the highest soup consumers still in the world, about a cup a day per person. It is still a very regular part of their diet. Many of their soups have glycine betaine providing foods in them, like wheat or rye in this rye soup, or, my friend, the beet, from which betaine gets its name. One of the things we know about betaine is that when we boil things containing it, 60 to 80% of the betaine goes right out into the cooking water. So every time we boil up our pasta and then throw that cooking water down the drain, we're saying goodbye to a lot of the betaine that was there. Same thing with spinach or chard. But if we're having beet soup and we're eating the broth that the beets were cooked in, then we're getting a lot of betaine. So, knowing this, I thought, let's look at what Poland's autism rates are. Poland's part of the EU, so they have good health care for children. Poland has many of its people that have gone to work in the UK in the last decade or two, where they worked in daycares and hospitals. They know what autism is. And what I found, move on. We'll go back to that slide. Next one. Next one. Next one. What they found in Poland is that they've got only 3.4 cases per 10,000 individuals being diagnosed, compared to the US, 200,000, or 200 per 100,000. I'm sorry, 200 per 10,000. So, let's take 4 and divide it into 200. We're looking at 1/50th the rate of autism in Poland as here in the United States. Well, then people are going to argue, I know, but genetics, it's genetics. I have a half Polish nephew, born and raised here in the United States, and he's autistic. So I don't really buy the genetic argument because we have many people of Polish heritage here in the United States, and I haven't noticed them being exactly freed from this modern day plague. Okay, let's go back to the BHMT. All right, so in autism we find that the children diagnosed with it do not seem to have quite as much choline and betaine in their plasma, and they also do not seem to have as much zinc. And remember, both zinc and glycine betaine are necessary for proper function of BHMT, that secondary pathway from homocysteine-to-methionine. All right, so if I got you all wanting to run out and have lots of beet juice, I actually don't know if cold pressed beet juice is all that healthy. I don't know how much will come out in pressing it compared to boiling it, but I know it comes out in boiling. So go have some borscht.